Most people remember Saw as that one horror franchise where a dying man puts people in traps and forces them to play sick games to survive. It became shorthand for torture scenes, gore, and impossible choices. That's the version everyone thinks they know. But if that's really all Saw was about, it wouldn't still be discussed today. It wouldn't have turned into a full franchise, multiple timelines, and a character like Jigsaw becoming one of the most debated figures in modern horror. Because the truth is, Saw was never just about surviving a trap. It was about something a lot more uncomfortable. It was about judgment. Not the kind that comes from the law or from society, but something more personal. Something closer to a question. What does it actually mean to deserve life? And that's where Jigsaw enters the picture. Because John Kramer, the man behind the Jigsaw identity, never saw himself as a killer. In his own mind, he wasn't randomly selecting victims. He wasn't a sadist. He wasn't even really punishing people in the traditional sense. He was testing them. Every person he chose had something in common. Not innocence, not guilt in the legal sense, but what he saw as a specific kind of disrespect toward life. People who were wasting it, abusing it, or treating it like it had no value. And instead of simply ending their lives, he believed he was forcing them into a situation where they would finally understand what life actually means. That's the core idea most people miss. In Saw, the traps are not designed as simple execution methods. They're designed as decisions. Almost every scenario gives the victim a choice. Painful, extreme, often unfair, but still a choice. Cut something off or die. Confess or suffer. Sacrifice or be erased. On the surface, that looks like cruelty. And in many ways, it is. But in Jigsaw's logic, the cruelty isn't the point. The point is what the victim chooses when everything else is removed. Because in his philosophy, people don't appreciate life until they are forced to risk it. And that's where the entire moral contradiction begins. Because the question Saw keeps pushing over and over again is not how do you survive, it's what are you willing to become in order to survive. And that question changes everything. Once you reframe the traps like that, Jigsaw stops looking like a random killer and starts looking like something else entirely. A judge. Not a legal one, but a moral one. Someone who decides that certain people don't deserve death, but also don't deserve to continue living the way they are. But this is also where the idea starts to collapse. Because even if you accept Jigsaw's philosophy for a moment, there's a fundamental problem in how it plays out. He doesn't actually give people fair chances. The traps are not neutral tests of character. They are extreme psychological and physical pressure systems designed to push people into panic, fear, and irrational decisions. And under those conditions, the idea of choice becomes blurry. Because a choice made under terror is not the same as a free moral decision. And that's where Saw quietly starts to shift from philosophy into contradiction. If your entire belief system depends on testing human morality, but you create conditions where morality breaks down under pressure, then what exactly are you measuring? Survival instinct? Desperation? Luck? This is where the idea of Jigsaw as a teacher starts to break. But the story doesn't stop there, because Jigsaw himself is only part of the equation. Something most people forget is that John Kramer doesn't act alone for long. Over time, his ideology spreads. People who survive him don't just leave. Some of them begin to adopt his worldview. And that's where Saw becomes something more complicated than a single villain story. Because once the idea of testing people spreads beyond Jigsaw himself, it stops being controlled. It becomes distorted. Different apprentices interpret his philosophy in different ways. Some become stricter, some become more emotional, some lose the moral justification entirely and focus only on the mechanism, traps, pain, outcomes. And that's when Saw quietly shifts again. Because now, the question is no longer just whether Jigsaw is right or wrong. It becomes whether his idea was ever stable in the first place. A philosophy that depends on absolute moral judgment in extreme conditions is already fragile. But once it is removed from its original creator, it becomes something else entirely. A system that no longer needs belief, only execution. And at that point, the Jigsaw ideology stops being about life appreciation and starts becoming a structure that can justify almost anything, depending on who is operating it. Which brings us back to the original idea people have about Saw, the dying man who makes people play games version. Because that version is incomplete. Jigsaw is not simply a killer designing traps, and he is not purely a misunderstood moral teacher either. He exists somewhere in between. A man who genuinely believes he is giving people a second chance, while simultaneously forcing them into situations where the concept of a fair chance no longer exists. And that contradiction is what makes Saw interesting in the first place. Because the deeper you go into it, the less it becomes about horror, and the more it becomes about control. Control over life, control over consequence, control over judgment. And the uncomfortable idea that someone could believe so strongly in their own moral framework that they are willing to completely remove other people's freedom in order to prove it. So when people say Saw is just about torture or shock value, they're missing the point. Because the real horror isn't the traps, it's the logic behind them. The idea that suffering can be transformed into truth, and that someone can decide what truth looks like for everyone else. In the end, Jigsaw is not a simple villain, but he is not a hero either. He is a warning, a reminder of what happens when morality becomes something you enforce instead of something you question. And that's why Saw still works today, not because of the traps, but because of the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of it. Who gets to decide what a human life is worth? And when that question is answered by one person alone, the system stops being justice and becomes something else entirely. But that's not even the most disturbing part. Because once you look past Jigsaw himself, the bigger question becomes something else entirely. What happens when people start agreeing with him? Not just surviving his traps, but actually believing that the people inside them deserve to be there in the first place. Because over time, something strange happens in Saw's universe. Jigsaw stops being just a person. He becomes an idea. And ideas are a lot harder to kill than people. You start noticing that even outside the traps, the world around him slowly adapts to his way of thinking. People begin to argue not just about whether his methods are cruel, but whether his targets were bad enough to justify what happened to them. And that shift is important, because it means the moral boundary is already breaking. At that point, Saw stops being about what happens inside the traps and starts reflecting something closer to society itself. Because if you strip away the horror setting for a second, what Jigsaw is doing is something very recognizable. He's categorizing people. He is deciding who is wasteful, who is irredeemable, and who still has value. And once that idea enters a system, even in fiction, it tends to spread beyond its original intention. Because the moment you accept that some people must be tested before they deserve life, you've already changed the definition of justice. Justice stops being about protecting people equally and starts becoming about evaluating them. But there's another layer to this that makes everything even more uncomfortable. Because in Saw, the people who design the traps after Jigsaw aren't always motivated by his philosophy. Some of them are driven by grief. Some of them by revenge. Some of them don't even fully believe in his moral framework anymore. They just inherit the structure. And this is where the idea collapses completely. Because once the system survives without the original belief, it no longer matters what Jigsaw intended. The machine keeps running, even when the meaning is gone. And that's when Saw quietly transforms again. Because what started as one man's warped philosophy becomes something closer to a self-sustaining cycle. A structure where people are placed into extreme situations and then judged based on how they react under pressure. But here's the uncomfortable reality behind that concept. Extreme situations don't reveal truth. They create distortion. People don't become their real selves when they are terrified, injured, or overwhelmed. They become versions of themselves shaped entirely by panic. Which means the entire foundation of the system is built on unstable ground. And yet, within the world of Saw, the results are treated as final. Survival equals worthiness. Failure equals discard. But life doesn't work like a controlled test. And that gap between theory and reality is where everything falls apart. Because if you build a system that assumes human behavior can be cleanly measured under extreme pressure, then you are no longer observing humanity. You are forcing it into a script and calling the outcome truth. Which brings us to something even more uncomfortable. Because if you zoom out far enough, Saw stops being just about one killer or even a group of followers. It starts looking like a reflection of a very old human idea. The idea that suffering reveals truth, that pain has meaning, that under the right level of pressure, people will naturally show who they really are. But the problem is, that belief is only comforting when you are not the one inside the system, because from the outside, it sounds like philosophy. From the inside, it is chaos. And Saw constantly exists between those two perspectives, which is why the story never fully resolves into Jigsaw is right or Jigsaw is wrong, because both interpretations miss the point. The real tension is not in the answer. It's in the fact that the system can be believed at all. And once a system like that becomes believable, it becomes repeatable. And that's where I'll leave it for today. Because this is what Shake the Lore is really about. Taking the stories everyone thinks they understand and looking at what they were actually trying to say underneath all the noise. If you enjoyed this breakdown, you already know what to do. And I'll see you in the next one.